Okay, welcome to our third week together, in which we introduce the idea of atmosphere. So we started by looking at people interacting with them and Gibson's idea of affordances, that different objects, different spaces would give us the opportunities for action. Then we wandered off into a design process and looked at how Zumthor and Utzon thought about the challenge of specific buildings and bringing together both their personal experience and the aesthetic and functional needs of the building. So today I want to start with atmosphere as another kind of affordance. What is the general atmosphere you get as you visit a space or as you enter a space? And then I'm going to talk about a particular bold effort to try and relate that sort of consideration to neuroscience. And we're going to see it isn't easy, but our whole effort in this course is to try and establish that conversation between the two. So, some time ago, there was a workshop or a symposium held in Helsinki under the auspices of Ballast Maher and his colleagues, and they talked about architecture and atmosphere, and there were three people: Gernot Böhme, Atmosphere, New Perspectives for Architecture and Design; Tonino Graf Era, Architectural Affordances, the Atmospheric Authority of Space; and Jean-Paul Thibault, Installing an Atmosphere. And I'm going to do a riff on some of the points these three people made to introduce the idea of atmosphere. I'm going to introduce some examples, and this is going to set the framework in which we go back and think about the brain a little more before seeing what Julio Bermudez and his colleagues did in trying to come up with a brain imaging approach to contemplative spaces. So, Böhme goes back to Hubert Tellenbach to say atmosphere is the sort of smell of the nest, the air that allows one to feel at home. So more generally, what is your first impression, or perhaps later your overall impression of a building that sets the environment within which the details come? So he says, let's think about buildings not in the sort of architectural digest form of glossy photographs of a particular perspective, but what is the space that's created by architecture, and what is the atmosphere or the mood it creates? He says it's vague, but in some sense it's spatial and emotional at the same time, a kind of spatially extended feeling. So how can we get a handle on that? Now, I want to remind you that a little while ago we saw Hannah Bennett's presentation of the library in Stockholm, where we had the great stairs ascending to the library, and then within the library the great stairs ascending to the reading room. And we suggested there was a symbolism of the depth and weight of learning. And in a sense that's sort of an atmosphere. So she used the language of symbolism. Today we're talking about atmosphere. Are these the same thing? A very nice example, I thought, of symbolism or atmosphere, depending on how you look at it, was one building in which there was a large, impressive courthouse with a grand entrance, and then below it there was a mean little door on the steps leading down to the prison beneath. And the idea of the majesty of the law and the crushing weight upon the convicted was very well conveyed by that architecture. So that mixture of symbolism and atmosphere is perhaps a continuing background for what I have to say today. Now, the title of this talk was Atmosphere as Another Kind of Affordance. What did I have in mind? Here's a quote from J.J. Gibson, who, as we said, is the father of affordances. So he says, the perceiving an affordance is not a process of perceiving a value-free physical object to which meaning is somehow added. It is a process of perceiving a value-rich ecological object. And what I want to stress is by value-rich, ecological. It's the word ecological that's important to him. He's referring to the action value of an object. It's pragmatic affordances. What can you do with the object? What opportunities for action does it give you? So Graf Era says, let's go beyond Gibson. We want to say that forms do not merely express causal relations and pragmatic affordances, but also sentimental and therefore atmospheric ones that permeate the space. So a slogan might be, Gibson affordances for motion, or action more generally, atmosphere, affordances for emotion or feeling and overall impact more generally. If I could just refer back to some earlier discussion, this idea of permeation. You might remember that we had a couple of examples and tried to think about them. One, an aesthetic example where Arnheim was talking about this design of Le Corbusier for Harvard, where we had this protruding gallery and the issue of what was the right way to position it above the ground, so that in some sense he talked about repulsion between this part of the building and the ground to find just the right level where the attraction and repulsion were balanced to give a good design. And I traced that way back to a biological example of a frog's trajectory being understandable in terms of the attraction of the prey, the worm, and the repulsion of the barrier, and how this could yield an appropriate trajectory between them. So there's some idea of processes that might act in the action domain can also act in the aesthetic domain. And so perhaps here there's the beginning of a clue to how the neuroscientist might look for shared processes between the Gibsonian and the non-Gibsonian affordances. I stress this is a promise for the future, not a current achievement. Okay, so just a little bit more from Burma. I apologize for all the words, but sometimes it's easier to see them. That he's again saying, we're not just looking at shape, we're looking at structure and articulation of spaces, open or closed, whatever. The architect at the same time sets suggestions for movement. So maybe don't try to read all the words in front of you, but the point is that we are looking for the architect. The building is setting both this emotional framework and providing the ability. So we are looking at both the Gibsonian and the atmospheric affordances at the same time. A later slide, but I might as well bring it forward now because I think it makes a good example, is the idea of a hospital where the sort of baseline of atmosphere is one of foreboding. Am I going to get better or not? What's the operation going to be? What drugs am I going to have to be forced to take? And then the architect, though, can find out ways of creating an atmosphere that at least reduces that sense of fear or foreboding, instills confidence, and so on. So there is both a function of the hospital and an atmosphere of the hospital, and the architect can serve to combine the two as well as possibly can be done. Let's just look at a few pictures. As we've said, a picture is not the point. We're concerned with the whole totality of being in the space. But this is a temple garden in Kyoto, and immediately the atmosphere is one of tranquility and relaxation. If you are a Buddhist steeped in certain types of practice, I would assume that the atmosphere would have further dimensions than those I experience as a Western tourist. But also, once we get that overall atmosphere, it can be reinforced as we begin to look at the way the sand is formed or the disposition of the stones and the bushes. And we can wonder about that wall at the back. Is that there as part of the setting of the atmosphere, or is that just a necessity to separate from the temple next door, as it were? But I think here we get a very strong sense of both the way that the details have assembled to give us the atmosphere, and the way in which, once we have the atmosphere, it then frames our appreciation of the details. Here is Edinburgh Castle, and here the atmosphere is one of fortification, of strength. But again, the context can change. If we were invading troops, then we would be very much aware of the design in terms of the fortifications, the defenses that we would have to attack. When we visit it today as tourists, perhaps what attracts our attention most is this doorway as a place of invitation to explore the interior, rather than as strongly a weak point in terms of those. So that give and take between the overall atmosphere that is perhaps our first impression and then the filling in of details. And a point that is part of our later discussion is that, of course, that first impression may not last. So a place that may be forbidding may become inviting, for example. Just walking down the hill from the castle, one sees to the side this street, a totally different atmosphere, but an inviting one. Here is a place that one is invited to explore, and then, of course, once one starts walking down the hill, if one chooses to do so, then there are the various shops to use, affordances for entering and buying, but also there are lots of details of the architecture that capture one's attention. So there is something of a paradox here, I think, between the idea of an atmosphere as being a global early impression and the idea that architecture must not only provide perhaps that initial statement as to what is this environment in which you now find yourself, but also must think about the details, and those details can be both aesthetic and practical, so that even though all these storefronts presumably have the same purpose, namely come on in and spend your money, nonetheless each one is distinctive. And on the other hand, as we look up here and here and here and here, we can see a certain joy in form rather than a functionality in form. So just a few more examples that can guide our discussion of this idea. Alvar Aalto, who is known as sort of the greatest Finnish architect, and whose protege is Juhani Ballast Maher, whose name I've mentioned and will mention again. Aalto, back in the 20s, wrote, "I am led to believe that most people, but especially artists, principally grasp the emotional content in a work of art. This is especially manifest in the case of old architecture. We encounter there a mood so intense and downright intoxicating that in most cases we don't pay a great deal of attention to individual parts and details if we notice them at all." Well, I agree with him about the mood, but I don't agree with him about the idea that we are unaware of the parts. As soon as and so what I'm going to look at next is Boa Nova. This is originally a tea house, now a restaurant on the coast near Porto in Portugal, designed by Alvar Aalto. And what I'm going to suggest is that you can't look at it and just get the mood. Here are three external views, one interior view. Now a very expensive restaurant instead of a tea house. But here the mood is indelibly set by one's awareness of the interplay of the rock, the building, the coast, the nearby church, and so on. So that the atmosphere is great, but it is complemented by the way the details we become aware of rather quickly contribute to it, and it frames them at the same time. And so the way I might put it is the atmosphere is perhaps a gist. So we talked briefly in the first week about vision and the idea that one doesn't get vision by purely looking at details. So we looked at one particular example where, recognizing quickly that this is a suburban scene, we get ideas like, well, where's the sky? Where's the house? Where's the grass? And things of this kind. Whereas if our first quick view was that we were in Manhattan, in New York, then we would throw away, as it were, a lot of our analytic machinery, and instead we would be looking at a vocabulary of skyscrapers and busy streets and so on. So that the gist is the setting for our visual analysis. The atmosphere, we might say, in some sense, is the setting for our analysis emotionally, not so much our analysis, our spontaneous feeling emotionally, but Thibault, who's another of our authors for the Finnish book, is stressing that atmosphere may change dynamically. Imagine that you're walking down a street and it has a lively atmosphere, and suddenly you realize there's nobody else on the street, and the atmosphere goes from one of pleasure, happy, relaxation, to one of perhaps fear. What is going on? Why have people gone? Why am I alone? What's going to happen to me? So this is the sort of aspect. Or as night falls, a place that looks friendly may become unfriendly. Or alternatively, the lights may suddenly go on and a place that looked dull may become joyous. So these are some of the ideas. But as I say, in vision, it's the interaction between the gist and the details is crucial for the experience, and some of that discussion of atmosphere just forgets about those details. And of course, we keep repeating, we're going to look at photos in this lecture, but we must always be thinking back to experiences of real buildings, real landscapes, where we have multi-sensory experience, and we as ourselves are actors and agents within that setting. And so it's that interaction that cumulatively provides both that overall atmosphere and those details that are essential to the way we act. So the point then is that people are in general part of it. When you design a building or when you experience a building, the role of people within it is part. Inhabitants, city dwellers, passers-by are part of the production of atmosphere. And Thibault asked whether or not it's possible to distinguish an atmosphere by the degree to which it allows people to be part of the production of the atmosphere itself. And I was very struck by this word, allows. In what sense does the people may help create the atmosphere, but when they do so, in what sense are they agents who wish to be part of that or not? And so I just show you a particular atmosphere which, for the people engaged at that time, was presumably one of national pride and joy. For those of us from outside that time and place and mood, it is one of horror. Okay, back to Graf Era. He has a very nice quote from a chap named Wigley. Architecture is but a stage set that produces a sensuous atmosphere. I think that fits in a way with the previous slide, but in general, let's think a little bit about a stage. We go to the theater, and then the stage designer has created an environment which is meant to captivate our whole intention. We stop thinking about the seat we're sitting in or the person next to us or the rustling of the programs or the noisy popcorn eaters, and instead we are transported into that little world. Now, the crucial difference, though, between the stage designer and the architect is the stage designer is given a script that already exists and is now saying, for the behavior of the people as set down by this dialogue and the stage directions, what would be an environment that more fully engages people in that experience, in fact draws them out of their own experience into the experience of those people on the stage. Whereas for the architect, there is no set script. There may be a constraint. This is a bank, this is a hospital, this is a home, but given that, people write their own scripts. But the scripts will, in some sense, play out differently depending on how the affordances for the building are provided. They'll play out differently depending upon the general mood that the building engenders. Am I depressed when I'm here, or am I exhilarated when I'm here? So I think that idea of architecture as a stage set is very good, but it doesn't just produce a sensuous atmosphere. It provides an environment in which we develop our own scripts within certain constraints of the typology of the building as adjusted to our own needs. So architectural atmospheres are responsible for immediate understanding, immediate contact, immediate rejection, and are generated fundamentally by everything, things, people, air, noise, and so it goes. But as I say, I don't think this sort of strict separation that some of the authors are giving us between here's atmosphere and here's Gibson, but for me that continual dialogue between how is the mood, the atmosphere, biasing your action within the building, and conversely how as you act and other people around you act, how does that change the atmosphere? And so we've talked about the action perception cycle. Maybe we could talk also about the atmosphere action perception cycle. So I've already suggested this, but here are some examples about the way the atmosphere may vary with the viewer. Graf Era talks about a major banking institution, the sort of traditional bank with large columns, and you enter and there's a huge space, and then there are the teller's windows, and so on. And so he distinguishes the atmosphere of power for those who venture there in search of a loan. The atmosphere reduces you to a supplicant. Can you get money from the bank? But it may also give an atmosphere of proud belonging for an employee who has a strong esprit de corps. I've already mentioned the hospital example, where we can imagine that the natural atmosphere of a hospital, because of the way people feel as they come there as patients, is tense, but the architect can provide conditions that diffuse it, as in a children's hospital with lots of murals of favorite story characters on the wall. So his slogan is, in designing buildings, architects should indeed contrive places that invite certain behaviors, and so be aware of how to create affordances and how they are perceived. And I would just say that the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, I would say this is their main concern. How do you take a particular typology of building? How do you understand the neural and mental processes of people and adjust the building? What sort of building will provide the right affordances and atmosphere in a home for Alzheimer's people? What would provide the right affordances to help encourage learning in a school, and things of this kind? Okay, and here's the question raised of, is it possible to design atmospheres? And let's just read what these people say and then just see how it relates to the discussion we've been having. So Bermudez goes back to the stage design idea, producing a certain climate. Stage designers know how to do this. Their work proves the intersubjectivity of atmosphere. If this were not the case, the whole project of stage design would be nothing at all. Okay, we can recognize that one building is meant to intimidate us, another building is meant to welcome us, etc., etc., etc. Though interestingly, current architecture in some sense moves away from intersubjectivity. You go to a well-established town in Europe, you walk around, you have no trouble recognizing the churches built before the Second World War. But if you look at the churches built in the last 20 years, you may not know they're churches until you read the sign on them. So there has been a loosening, perhaps, of standards. And yet, as we've said, there are ways in which one can think about, hey, I don't know which kid's going to be in the classroom, but I want it to be an environment for learning. I don't know which patient's coming to the hospital or what the disease is. I want to, in some sense, provide them with a positive view to which the medical practice can respond. Thibault emphasizes that a project evolves in time. So we have on one hand the people who want to think of atmosphere as something the building has an atmosphere, it's there. And Thibault keeps reminding us, and I think it's very valuable, that atmosphere changes in time, the interaction between the space and the people. And now, here's where we have to sort of try and bridge between these viewpoints. He says, I don't think we can design an atmosphere, but we can design the conditions for an atmosphere. We can design conditions that afford certain activities for the people. So I think that is in some way the point I was trying to make when I was discussing stage design. The stage designer has a script written by a playwright with particular people saying particular lines as the plot unfolds, and given that knowledge, he or she tries to create a stage setting which will make, in some sense, an enhancement of that interaction rather than a distraction from it. In the case of architecture, unless you're Frank Lloyd Wright, you're probably not telling people how they must behave. You're understanding there will be a range of personal behavior, one person, a family, or a large public, and now you're providing a setting within which they can do what they want. Some of the things can be very constrained, others can be loose. We design conditions that afford certain activities or actions, and the atmosphere is that sort of general mood or framework within which, perhaps changing over time, those take place. The interaction between the space and the activity in that space has the potential to produce an atmosphere. Now, our concern in this course is to see to what extent we can establish a dialogue between architecture and neuroscience. And I think it's fair to say that we can't go directly from this is the design of the Sydney Opera House to these are how the neurons fire in Utsen's brain. But what we tried to do last time with, for example, our discussion of Zumthor's half-forgotten images come to mind, yet all is new, to try and say we can start with some process within either the design of architecture or the experience of architecture, or maybe even the building of smart architecture, and we can try and, in cognitive terms perhaps, find what are some of the things going on, such as the interaction between remembering and imagination, and then there we can turn to the neuroscience and say, okay, if we do some brain imaging, or if we record from the brains of animals, can we see ways in which we can understand neural structures or even neural interactions that could provide mechanisms for some of these cognitive processes that now we can understand at the cognitive level, and now if we place them, as it were, in the head of people with individual experiences, can issue in a unique design process or a unique experience of action within a particular building. So it seems to me that in fact our four participants in this Helsinki symposium are rather negative. And so I'm going to make life tough for us and then use the example of Julio Bermudez to see how we can begin to dig ourselves out. All right, so Ballast Maher says the field of neuroscience is now somewhat gaining a grasp on the mental processes and phenomena that support the idea of emergent rather than finer understanding. Not sure what that means. I think it just means that we don't proceed like following very simple instructions. People can do diverse things, they can have new experiences. But there's been increasing value placed on the idea that consciousness may not be something that we contain in our brains, but something that is out there in our relationship with the world. Okay, this is getting a little dangerous, but let's just read it again and we'll come back to it. Consciousness may not be something that we contain in our brains, but something that is out there in our relationship with the world. Okay, then Ballast Maher says, today's neuroscience concerns itself only with things inside the brain. It wants to locate all phenomena inside the brain, but this eliminates the possibility that things such as empathy might be located outside the brain in the existential experience of the human being. For me, this is just a misunderstanding of what neuroscience is about. One of our earlier slides was the action-perception cycle, the idea that we, at a particular time, are in a cognitive state encoded in our neurons in the brain. Our eyes are looking in a particular direction, our ears are more or less attentive, our hands are available to touch some things and not others, and given all that, we currently receive stimulation of all our receptors, but that stimulation depends upon the state of brain and body in relation to the external world. Now, what we make of that, again, will depend upon the state of our brain. I'm looking for a friend, then as I scan the crowd, there may be many faces, but I recognize almost nothing about them until I find one that appears to be my friend. And then I have to tend more carefully, and then I realize without closer attention it is my friend and move towards them, or I recognize that it's not my friend and I continue my search. The point is that as a neuroscientist, as I give an account of, let's say, visual processing, of the process of attention, of goal-directed attention, how is it bottom up, as it were, something grabs my attention, a sudden movement, a sudden flash of light, is what we might call bottom up. It's the input is grabbing my attention versus that search for my friend, where the way I pay attention depends very much upon my goal. Can I find that friend? We saw the example of the Yarbus eye movements with the painting, where people's eye movements examining the unexpected stranger returning from the prison camps, how the question asked determined those. So I don't think it makes sense to say consciousness is something out there. What we're really saying is that consciousness, yes, is something in our brain that expresses our relationship with the world. And the whole idea of the action-perception cycle is to deny the idea that we want to locate all phenomena inside the brain. It's rather we're trying to say what is going on in the brain that makes it possible for us to interact with the world, to experience the world. And then we get into phenomena like a young child, their consciousness is less informed by experience, by the richness of memory. It is changing because neurons can change their connections. We have neuroplasticity. Understanding that mechanism lets us understand how the child can be conscious in the world and learn. An Alzheimer's patient has lost the use of memory. That's a change in the brain. And then we try to adjust our social and practical environment so that that person can nonetheless have a relatively calm and satisfying life. So I just think that this idea of neuroscience concerns itself only with things inside the brain is just mistaken. We're talking about perception, we're talking about memory, we're talking about action, we're talking about language, and all these things are in terms of how is it that because we have a human brain in a human body, we can interact with the world. And okay, that's enough about that. I wish somebody were yelling at me why they think Ballast Maher has the right statement. But there's a move of people who I think miss the point that neuroscience is not what is in the brain and forget everything else, but rather how does the brain mediate those interactions with the world. Okay, a few more of these quotes, which are in some sense surprisingly uninformed or negative about the brain. Graf Era, we need a renewed concept of the body. This contains all the functions that have before been attributed to the brain, the heart, and the psyche. For me, a felt bodily perception of atmosphere is better than neuroimaging, better than finding the location of sensation in the brain. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. So notice that at each stage, people have had a folk psychology. And so for a long time, the heart was thought of as the seat of the emotions because one of the big indicators of our emotional state is the variation in heart rate. And I remember quite touchingly when the first person was implanted with a mechanical heart, their family was very concerned, will he love us anymore? Because they accepted that folk psychology of emotion as being located in the heart. And then I guess psyche might take us into various classic views, but also into Freud. the brain. So a felt bodily perception of atmosphere is better than neuroimaging. Okay, now this, when you say better than, this may be a defensible position. I think this is really still, as we think about brain, cognition, and architecture, this is really an open question. An architect has a long experience, both as a student and as a practitioner, of working in buildings, seeing how people react to them, reacting to them himself or herself, and putting himself in the shoes of the, as it were, the future inhabitants. And I think it's a reasonable argument at this stage to say there's nothing about the brain that's going to change that. If you're an architect with a good sense of how people will feel about the building, then hire that architect. And if you've got another architect who just happens to have taken a neuroscience degree, that's probably not the right qualification. So we're really trying to say, where can we get a dialogue going that might say, yes, well maybe, yeah, if you're an architect and you cannot, in some sense, anticipate what the atmosphere of your building will be, and if you cannot anticipate what the affordances are for the functions that the building is meant to meet, then knowing about the brain won't help you. But perhaps neuroimaging can begin to give us understanding of how different brains may feel in different ways. By knowing that Alzheimer's progresses through certain portions of the brain, starting with the hippocampus, may give us some insight into how their bodily perception will change, and how, therefore, the architect, who hopefully is not an Alzheimer's victim, can anticipate those perceptions, those bodily feelings. So it's that sort of dialogue that may, in some sense, allow us to agree with Graf Era in what he says, and yet at the same time not take it as an argument against pursuing this rapprochement between neuroscience and architecture. Okay, when we locate a feeling in the brain, we have not explained anything. Location is not explication. Speaking from a phenomenological point of view, the brain does not exist. Wow. Yeah. In a sense, that's going to be part of the discussion we'll be having in the rest of this lecture. If I just look at a brain imaging thing and I say, oh, there's a blob here when you do that, and a blob here when you do that, that doesn't explain anything. And for the neuroscientist, the challenge is to go beyond a sort of catalog of blobs to begin to say, yes, but different parts of the brain are constantly interacting. What is it that the brain is doing with the perception, with the memory, in generating the action, within the action perception cycle, that those different blobs take care of? So, yes, from a So the suggestion is, yes, from a phenomenological point of view, if all you're saying is I look at other people wandering around, I have no evidence that they have brains rather than cotton wool in their heads. So if that's what you mean by phenomenology, the brain does not exist. But if I want to understand why people behave in particular ways and why particular types of disorders can change the way people behave, then the brain certainly does exist, and we need to understand it. Now, Burma says the concept of the atmosphere was successful partly due to the phenomenological method, which sought to take phenomena and look for the order and relations between these phenomena and not look for something behind the phenomena. And this is really where we strongly disagree. For the neuroscientist, I would say, yes, I want to look at the phenomena. How do people behave? How do people describe their experience? What do they claim to be conscious of? But as I've said, people have different brains. The phenomena can change. One of the most amazing things that I mentioned very briefly with respect to the body schema is people with damage to the right parietal lobe will lose perception and memory of the left half of the world and the left half of their body. So my suggestion is that where the architect may currently have to depend upon intuition and verbal description, perhaps the methods of cognitive science, and then in even more detail the methods of neuroscience, will allow a an analysis of interacting sub-processes, and by knowing that there are different processes at work rather than just the mere phenomenal experience, one may begin to tap into them differently. A little bit like the great success of advertising is often the appeal to the subconscious rather than to the overt conscious phenomena. So I'm going to emphasize an exploratory study by Julio Bermudez and his colleagues in a moment. But first, let me just, for those of you who know less about the brain, just say a little bit about how hard it is to understand the brain. And on the one hand, we have brain imaging, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which yields blobs of activity for one task versus another. And on the other hand, the human brain has something on the order of 10 billion neurons and maybe 10 to the 15th synapses. And so when I'm working as a neuroscientist, not worrying about architecture, one of my big concerns is what is really going on in the interactions here, and why does that yield certain types of fMRI imaging, so that I can understand better how to see the fMRI data not just as new phenomena in themselves, but as windows on the details of how the brain works. Okay, so just a little background. There's structural magnetic resonance imaging, and basically what happens is that you throw in an external magnetic field at a biological system, and hydrogen atoms will be responding in a way that can be picked up by detectors. Computers can then grab that, and depending on the particular parameters that are set in these processes, you can either use a T1 paradigm, which gives a lower signal for water content and a high signal for fat, or conversely the T2, which gives you a high signal for water, a low signal for fat. But as you can see by these two, this way you can begin to see the structure. And so the computer extracts from this a three-dimensional structural view. So for example, here we can see the ventricles, the gaps between the brain tissue. And then these can be used for medical diagnosis or just to set a framework, because, here's the important point, just as our faces vary, our heights vary, the length of our arms vary, so the structure of our brains vary, the folding of our brains vary, the location of a particular named brain structure like the hippocampus or the primary visual cortex may shift somewhat from individual to individual. And so if we want to really understand where those blobs are, we have to, in some sense, register them against the structure of the brain. And so what we'll normally do is we will have a structural analysis to say what's the anatomy of the brain, and then the functional MRI will basically pick up how much blood is flowing. So the idea is that presumably the harder your neurons are working, the more oxygen they need, and that means there's going to be more blood flow in that area. And so you can, by methods we won't describe here, pick up how blood oxygen level changes, the so-called bold signal. And that way you can build up a three-dimensional map of the brain during a particular task, saying over a period of a few seconds or longer if you want to, how much blood has been pumping oxygen into that little level. So what basically the method does is it will divide the brain into cubes, voxels, volume elements of roughly a millimeter or so on a side, and then a common procedure says, okay, that information is very noisy, so let me look at the person doing task A and task B, and what I'm charting here, surprisingly, is not the blood flow, but the statistical significance that the blood flow is greater for task A than for task B. So here we've had a patient doing, or a subject doing some task, doing another task, and now statistical processing has said, and the color codes it, how likely is it that there's more blood flow and thus some form of greater activity in that part of the brain than in others. So when we see these, let's call them blobs, in an imaging paradigm, they're often not showing you what the blood flow is, but is this a place with greater blood flow? Okay? And here I have to make those caveats about how that relates to the real brain. The brain is a distributed computer, in quotes. It has many different regions, and the neurons within them are providing that final level of analysis, and they're competing and cooperating to achieve any function. So just because a blob shows up when we do an A greater than B comparison, in other words, we're saying if the blob says this is how likely it is there's more activity in region X than in region B, in task B, we cannot conclude that X is the processor for A. All we're saying is there may be many processors, whether at the level of regions or the level of neurons interacting, and we're just simply saying that when we do A instead of B, X is more active for A than for B, but it may still be important for computing task B, and this is something overlooked in many analyses. The other thing I want to remind you of is that each voxel contains billions of neurons. So that, what is it that the bold signal is picking up? Well, we think it's the integrated synaptic activity, not the firing. And so I suggest we need the vampire model of neurons, which is not only how they compute, but also how they suck blood. But that's a topic for another day. Okay, just to finish this little reminder of a few facts about the brain before we look at the work of Bermudez et al. Brodmann, over 100 years ago, noted that if he took a stained brain and cut little slices, then the overall cortical structure was the same at a general level of similarity. There were 6 layers, but actually the depth of the layers, the density of cells in each of the layers varied from place to place. And so that you can actually use this sample as a signature for association cortex, motor cortex, and primary visual cortex. And on that basis, he divided the brain into different regions and numbered them in a way that is not particularly clear. But this little picture, which I'm not going to dwell on at any length, is just to show here is the side view of the brain with the regions that Brodmann suggested. Here is a medial view, a middle view, cut down the middle, looking out view. And these are all areas of cerebral cortex, and we get to know that certain areas seem to be like 17 feeding into 18 and 19. That's how vision gets started. For the sense of touch and body sense, area 1 is where things get started moving into 2 and 3, 22, 44, and 45. 22 back here, 44, 45 there, are involved in language and so on. But again, if I'm using language, I might be describing what I'm seeing around me, so the integration of the visual areas and the language areas and the speech areas are all part of what gives the overall performance. And the other thing I want to stress is that there's a lot of brain underneath the cerebral cortex. So the cerebellum is well known for allowing us to move gracefully. The basal ganglia seem to be involved in reward. The hippocampus, as we said, is certainly involved in episodic memory, among other things. So that this is just to say that we have this idea of a standard brain. So when we do a particular imaging experiment, we try to say, how can I use that structural analysis of the brain, the structural MRI, to map that, to sort of distort the three-dimensional structure onto a standard analysis of the brain, for which research has given us a pretty good idea of where the Brodmann areas lie. And therefore we can say if I see a blob here, which could be over, just as your eyes could be at a different height above your chin, depending on who you are. So we can say that although this is here relative to here, when we map it onto here, we can now say pretty confidently, okay, that's in parietal cortex, or that's in area 17, and so on. So that's the sort of methodology that comes together. This is just a reminder that there are these internal areas below the cortex, such as the hippocampus, the amygdala, and so on, that are very much involved in emotion processing. Here's one of the favorite figures that neuroscientists like to show. goes back to 1991 when they took the monkey cortex and just says, what are all the little regions of the brain where putting in electrodes will see response to visual stimuli, and then what are the connections between them? And there are about 30% of the possible connections have been shown by staining the brain. This just to give you some idea that I can see why many people would like to stick with phenomenology and forget about neuroscience, because here we haven't even got into, well, what's going on in here? What are the neurons? What are they doing? But, so I think my penultimate slide before we get to Bermudez is just to show you a couple of drawings, one by Ramon y Cajal, the great Spanish neuroanatomist who flourished around 1900, but well before and afterwards, and the other from John Szentagotay, perhaps the greatest neuroanatomist from Hungary, who just died a few years ago, and just showing that if you look here, you can see the drawing of the different cell types and their arrangement, without being in any sense concerned about the fine details on this meeting. You can see that the neuron types are very different, the pattern of connectivity is very different, and so we have, in fact, a beautiful architecture of the brain, and we have this enduring challenge to relate the diversity of form to function, noting at the same time that the brain is continually changing. We learn, and so in some sense we have a set of virtual machines, like a machine for French versus a machine for English, that restructures the brain and exploits the capabilities of all these different parts. Okay. Oh no. Windows will shut down in less than a minute. I hope it doesn't. Microsoft has a lot to answer for. Okay, so just to finish this, bring in the social dimension, and that is, and in a sense this goes back, I think, to our discussion with Ballast Maher about wanting to reduce everything to the brain. No, we don't. So we want to understand neurons. Ladies and gentlemen, your patience. It says it's restarting, so okay, let's hope that we'll get the machine back. And actually, I remember what my slides are, so I'll just keep going. So the point then is that there's a lot of interest recently in what we call social neuroscience, where we're looking at how the brain works, not only in terms of just the perception of objects and things and interaction with them, but also to what extent we have evolved to mediate our social interactions with our conspecifics. And that'll be a topic I'll be emphasizing next time, and getting into the discussions of how empathy might relate to our experience of buildings and other things as well, in addition to our empathy for other people. Okay, so if we get a computer back, and whether we do or not, the story I want to get into now is the work of Julio Bermudez from Washington, D.C., who with a team of people has been doing brain imaging of contemplative spaces. And so what he did is he got people to look at images, and the images were of the following form. He would either take an ordinary building, a school, an office building, or something of this kind, and give 4 images and present them to the subject for something like 80 seconds for each image, then 40 seconds, then 80 seconds, 40 seconds, to give something of the impression of coming from the outside of the building to the inside. And so one block of imaging was what happens in the people's brain, fMRI imaging, what happens in the people's brain when they're seeing 5 of these sequences for ordinary buildings of sort of everyday experience. And then that was the control condition, and the experimental condition was to it's getting Windows ready, isn't it nice? The experimental condition was to take 5 buildings and And here is the first methodological problem with this very interesting study, that the 5 buildings were called contemplation-inducing buildings, but in fact what they were found from among 5 of the top 10 buildings that Bermudez had identified, famous buildings for evoking a special architectural experience. So in addition to Le Corbusier's chapel at Ronchamp, contemplative space, or Chartres Cathedral, another evocative space, there was also the Salk Institute, walking into the courtyard, and, well, maybe it's a space that induces contemplation, but it's not a space that in itself is associated with any contemplative tradition. And then there's the Pantheon, which is now a church in Rome, but was built by Romans to celebrate, I guess, their martial rights, and so on. So that the design of the experiment was, let's see what happens to the brain on ordinary buildings versus contemplation-inducing architecture. And the twofold concern is the building over here really contemplation-inducing, or is it just famous? And so if I look at this, I see some images I've never seen before. I try to make sense of them. I see this, and it's stuff that's, if I'm an architect, I'm probably familiar with in great detail. So in one case, am I really responding to the space, or am I just, what can I make of this over here? And what does this bring back to me of this fine architectural experience over here? So that's one issue. Now, when they conduct the experiment, I apologize for the lack of image, but I hope at least I'm making some sense. So, setting that aside, what happens? The design of the experiment is very interesting. On the one hand, they do the brain imaging, but then when the people get out of the scanner, they give them a long questionnaire about how they were responding to the images. And then they also do an interview. The experimenters interview the subject, so that they're in some sense trying to bridge the two worlds that we've been worrying about in the last few minutes, namely the world of phenomenology, if you will, the world of experience. What am I doing? What am I experiencing as I look at the images versus what's going on in my head? And the challenge for Bermudez et al. Is to see if there's a relation between them. And the difference is there, both the experiment versus control and control versus experiment. And in the time we have together today, it's not going to be my purpose to try to make sense of what the different brain regions could be contributing. But the question mark I'm raising in the first place is just given the fact that in the one case you're trying to make sense of images you've never seen before, and the other case you're in some sense evoking memories of a great piece of architecture. Is the real difference to do with inducing contemplation as such, or the difference between search of something new versus reliving an experience? Nonetheless, what was interesting was that most of the subjects said that they felt really engaged, drawn into, relaxed when they were looking at the architectural buildings, and much less so when they were looking at the everyday buildings, if you will. And as I say, the initial study imaging just showed that difference between, on the average, what lights up more when people look at the control buildings, what lights up more when people look at the experimental buildings. But then the very nice feature was to make use of that questionnaire and say, now for each individual, we have a measure of what they call depth of experience. So you take they took two people, would go through the questionnaires and try to say, well, how engaged, how deep was the experience the person got from looking through the images. And then after some debate, they came up with a score of saying how much each person was engaged in the experimental versus the control condition. And then what they did, which was clever, was to then say, okay, I've got here this score of how deeply the person experienced the architectural buildings, the famous architectural buildings. Let's go back to their individual fMRIs, and now instead of just saying here on the averages the difference between an everyday building brain and an architectural experience brain, let's instead now say for individuals, can I have a scale of how much the brain lights up as the depth of experience increases or decreases? And in fact, the finding, you'll be delighted to know that Microsoft is working on updates on my computer. I cannot thank them enough for this help they're providing us today. What they found that was interesting was that as the depth of experience increased, well, I suppose if it's depth it's going this way, in a sense the activity of various brain areas would decrease. So the idea was that as you became more immersed in that external experience, rather than worrying about what's going on outside and making sense of it, then certain brain areas would damp down. So I think that's the primary finding, which fits a lot of other evidence, the way in which as you become more engaged in an activity, the brain can reduce the activity of extraneous areas, so that most activity is focused in very small places that can just do the necessary processing for that task. So let's just worry for a moment about some of the... So first let's just celebrate this as what the authors call it in their title, an exploratory study. It's an attempt to move into the area that can address the concerns of our four authors in the Atmosphere book by saying that we can perhaps get some new insights into the phenomena, in this case depth of experience, by understanding that different parts of the brain are differentially engaged in looking at a bunch of scenes versus experiencing it, and so on. The shortcomings, well, as I've said, it's not clear whether you're really looking at contemplation versus non-contemplation inducing architecture. It's not clear what happens when you just see a sequence of 4 scenes rather than experience the 3-dimensional space and walk into it yourself. It's not clear that the best way to experience a contemplation-inducing space is by walking into it from the outside rather than sitting quietly for several minutes as you let the atmosphere permeate you, as it were. But if you've got somebody in a scanner, there's not much you can do about this. So in future, we hope to see more and more portable EEG helmets and so on, where we can begin to look at the signal as people conduct the real experience. Now, on the other hand, we do have studies of people who meditate, and their fMRI works fine because we can put them in the scanner, and scanners make a terrible noise and it's an uncomfortable position. But if you're a skilled meditator, given a little bit of time to adjust to the scanner, you can basically close out the noise, close out the discomfort, and enter that meditative state. And there you can see what does light up. And Bermudez and his colleagues do come up with an honest conclusion, as it were, and that is that the effect of the contemplation-inducing architecture, as they call it, externally induced contemplation, if you will, and the brain blobs that light up for somebody who knows how to meditate when they're in there, you get a different pattern of activation. So there's a a research question there, which fits in with much of our general concern in neuroscience in relating form and function in the brain, is when we look at that overlap, what might that be serving that is shared between the two conditions? When we look at what is distinctive, what is that difference between shutting yourself off from the world versus opening yourself out to a world with a particular atmosphere? Well, it looks like Microsoft is not going to let me show any more slides today. So let me just conclude with one experience. Many years ago, I was standing at the southwest tip of Australia, where the Indian Ocean meets the Southern Ocean. It was getting towards sunset. There was a strong wind buffeting me. The waves were crashing on the rocks. So I had both the sight and the sound of that. The sky was turning a glorious sunset pattern, and I was, as it were, transported. And so the question I leave you with today is, when we talk about this, perhaps not contemplation inducing, but this transporting architecture, this exceptional architecture, this atmosphere that draws you out of yourself to experience that building, to what extent are we within a man-made domain, and to what extent is the architect tapping into what presumably are some innate ways in which we evolved in interaction with nature before the construction of modern technology and modern architecture? And with that, I thank you, but I do not thank Microsoft. Talk to you next week. The bastard.